Hi there, welcome to another English Language A-Level video with me, Paul Heselton. I'm Curriculum Leader for English Language A-Level at QE Darlington. And this is another one of a series of videos that we'll be doing about CLD, Children's Language Development. This one is on writing, and we're kind of at the back end of CLD writing now. We've gone through various theories. We've, in the last lessons, looked at spelling. And now we're just going to have a think about Lexis and grammar. So if you're going to be applying those two language levels, which you ought to be in any kind of CLD question that you do, this video is for you. So let's have a think about this idea of, just make my head slightly bigger. Let's have a think about grammar, first of all. So if we're thinking about children's grammar in pieces of writing, essentially, we're looking at two areas on that. So how controlled is the grammar and how much variety have we got in the child's grammatical choices? So think of it in two ways, control and variety. What I want you to do is get a piece of paper and to write down a list of grammatical things that you would be looking at on any child's piece of writing. Okay? Pause the video there, get writing your list. Okay, right, let me talk through some of the things that I would be looking at if I was examining children's grammar in their CLD writing. First of all, sentence function. There's a lot you can say about sentences, and why not look at the variety of sentence functions that are going on in there? So what have we got? Have we got declaratives, interrogatives, imperatives, exclamatives? So is there a range of different sentence functions that are going on? If there isn't, does that limit the effectiveness of the piece? For example, if this is a piece of narrative writing, would some of the dialogue, for example, have been improved if there were a variety of different sentence functions that are going on there? Okay, so that's quite a nice, easy grammatical area to have a look at. Second area that you could look at is sentence types or constructions. So this is often a marker of the level of sophistication of the child. Are they able, for example, to do things like subordination? So that can they construct subordinate clauses and therefore complex sentences? Can they do things like, when it's 9 o'clock, I will leave when it's 9 o'clock. So that is a complex sentence because it's got a subordinate clause when it's 9 o'clock. Okay, so if a child is able to, in a controlled way, use complex sentences or compound complex sentences, that enables them to communicate more nuance and subtlety of meaning. If you've got a 7-year-old who is writing in great big elongated compound sentences, then obviously link that in with Kroll, Barry Kroll, saying, well, this is evidence that the child is probably in Barry Kroll's stage 2, the consolidation stage, because they're writing down in the same way as they're talking. Okay, next thing to look at possibly is sentence length. Again, if you've got lots of variety in sentence length, that shows that you've got a good level of interest that's being produced in the text. Not much more to say about that. The thing about sentence control is an important one, because, when you're reading it, are you a bit distracted by the lack of full stops in appropriate places, or are commas being put in strange places? If there is a lack of sentence control, the essential problem with that is that it diverts you, the reader, from the actual meanings and representations that are going on. The other area that you could look at is pronouns. So how skillfully is the child using pronouns to refer back to earlier reference? So anaphoric references, references back. If you've got a very skilled piece of writing, it may well be that there are cataphoric references going on, where a character is referred to by using a pronoun initially, and that creates interest and intrigue, and we get to hear later on exactly who that person is. So look at the range of pronouns that are being used. Are they being skillfully done? In a very early piece of writing, you may well find that there is a complete avoidance of pronouns, in which case that's a marker of a low level of sophistication. Other area to look at is verbs. Look, for example, if a piece of writing is completely dominated by active voice verbs, that may lower the level of formality of the piece or make it more straightforward. The passive voice, if it's skillfully used, if it's used in a standard way, is it being used to depersonalize the text or to formalize the text? Or does it put the focus on a passive voice sentence on the actual action that's happening rather than on the person that's doing the action? So be on your guard to identify and certainly credit it if you see a child using the passive voice. Let's say a 7-year-old in a piece of narrative using in a controlled way the passive voice. That's definitely something that's worth focusing on. Also, in terms of verbs, look at use of auxiliaries. So remember, in English, we have primary auxiliary verbs and modal auxiliary verbs. Your primary auxiliary verbs are to be, to have, and to do. So we use those to construct various tenses and aspects of the verb. Like, for example, going back to the passive voice, in order to create the passive voice, then you have to use the primary auxiliary verb to be. So to what extent is the child able to control their writing by using primary auxiliary verbs in a kind of standard way? And what use perhaps is being made by modal auxiliary verbs, by which I mean words like must, should, may, could, etc. And if relevant, you could point out the difference between epistemic and deontic modal auxiliary verbs. Epistemic modal auxiliary verbs are verbs which are weak in force, usually, like may, could, and deontic modal auxiliary verbs have high force, like must or should, usually, although it does depend on the context. More things to say about verb. Look at verb tenses. So if you're looking at a piece of narrative, is the child able to keep consistent verb tense? If it starts off in the past tense, does it continue all the way through in the past tense? Is the child also able to manipulate verb aspect as well? So aspect means whether it's in the simple form or in the progressive form. So when I was cycling to work today, it poured with rain. So there I've got two different aspects. I've got the continuous one, when I was cycling, because it was a continuous action that took quite a long time. And then it poured with rain is simple. Okay, so that's verb aspect. You've also got the notion of verb agreement. So is the verb form that's used, is it standard English in terms of going with that person? If a child has written something like, we was walking to town, obviously that's non-standard, because in standard English you would be saying, we were walking to town, because we happen to use in standard English for the first person plural form, were rather than was. So that may be a kind of dialectical form that is coming through, in which case it's showing spoken features. Now, if that's put in dialogue, where the child has deliberately chosen that form in order to show a regional dialect, that's absolutely fine, and therefore that shows good skill and control. So it does depend on the context. And generally look out for standard or non-standard features. So, for example, has the child used double negatives, for example? If they have, again, that would be considered non-standard and it would lower the level of formality. So there's plenty for you to point out in terms of grammar. Okay, grammar is a really important element that you can accrue a lot of marks from. Okay, so I'm going to give you some individual sentences, and what you need to do is you need to deconstruct them in terms of their grammar. Here's an example, and these incidentally are taken from, I think they're taken from the AQA textbook. I could be wrong, but I think they are in there. Here's one, the flames was falling down everywhere. Right, so when you see that, you can perceive that seems to be non-standard. But it's another job to be thinking, well, what is actually non-standard about it? So in standard English, it would be the flames were falling down everywhere. So the issue here is to do with the primary auxiliary verb. And it's non-standard because of the auxiliary verb to be. And what we have here is a lack of subject-verb agreement. So this is a common non-standard dialectical form. And the interesting thing to say about it is that it may be the child just copying from everyday casual adult speech. So it's the sort of things that they're hearing and they're writing it down in their piece of writing. So you could link it in that case to Skinner's idea of behaviourism. Okay, so that's the sort of detail that I'm wanting you to do for the following utterances. Here they come. So pause the video there and write down what each of them would be in standard English and what seems to be the issue in terms of how and why it's non-standard. Okay, so hopefully you've done all 9 of those, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk through them. These are the sorts of grammatical points that you'd make in the exam. You're not going to write an entire paragraph about one individual point, but you're going to do like a brief reference to these. So let's take the first one. The door shaked. Well, it's overextension that you've got here. It's a kind of virtuous error that you've got. You've got an overextension of the ed past tense inflection on an irregular strong verb. It just so happens that in standard English, the past tense form of it is shook rather than shaked. So perfectly logically, the child has put ed on the end of the base form, and that's called overextension. All of them had died except from one. So here the issue is about the preposition. So brush off your AO1 knowledge about word classes. Always try and identify which word class the issue is from. So here it's to do with the preposition. So it's non-standard in terms of prepositional usage, and in standard English it would be for instead of from. And out came a dragon. Okay, well, the issue with this is that it's a low level of formality. I mean, it's not necessarily non-standard, but it's a low level of formality because you've got a sentence that's beginning with a coordinating connective. And, okay, and the job of coordinating connectives is to link together one clause to another. So if you put it at the beginning of a sentence, that lowers the level of formality. Now, writers do this all the time, and journalists. Okay, so definitely don't label it as being wrong, but it's certainly it's a low level of formality. Maybe the child has consciously done it. You'd have to weigh up within the context of the text whether that child has deliberately done it for an effect or whether it's kind of unconsciously done. He didn't do nothing wrong. Okay, so this is your non-standard double negative. It's the sort of thing that people say for emphasis all the time. It's called the emphatic double negative, and it's perfectly acceptable in other languages, like, for example, in French, where we go ne pas, where the standard form is actually a double negative. But in English, it is non-standard. How are we doing so far? Let's move on to the next one. This is, he built an army of soldiers up. Now, that's not easy to say. It's not easy to say because in standard English, you'd be saying he built an army of soldiers up. So the indefinite article in standard English would be an, since it pre-modifies, it comes before a word beginning with a vowel. They was extremely rich. This is, again, lack of subject-verb agreement. So it's like the first one that we looked at. So it's a non-standard form of the past tense relational verb to be, because in standard English it would be they were extremely rich. The rest of the group ran off to show their parents what we have got. Something odd about that sentence, isn't there? It's pronoun inconsistency. Right, so because you've got they, the rest of the group, their parents, so that's a third person plural possessive pronoun, but then you've got a first person plural subject pronoun there. So it's leaping about in terms of pronouns, and therefore it's inconsistent. It's also inconsistent in terms of verb tense as well, because that's in the past tense, whereas this bit here is in the perfect form. So there's inconsistency. And then finally, my favourite teacher, she is very special. Well, what we've got is double nominalisation here, because we've got the subject here, and then we've got a pronoun, the third person singular subject pronoun there. So you've got two lots of nominalisation. And again, that's characteristic of informal speech. Okay, so these are the sorts of morphological or syntactical details of grammar that, like I say, you're not going to spend an entire essay doing about, but in one particular ghetto of your essay, it may well be that you're identifying certain patterns, link it in with the kind of meanings and the contexts. Okay, so I said we were going to talk about grammar and Lexis. What about Lexis? So here you're thinking, well, how appropriate and varied are the child's lexical choices? Two ideas there. So how appropriate, do they make sense for the audience and the genre and the purpose? And how varied, how effective are they? Have we got a level of variety? So these are very straightforward. Lexical range. So is the child, for example, if they're writing a story and they're using lots of pre-modifying adjectives, is there a range and variety going on? Or is there, like the example that we've got in the textbook where we were looking at Kroll's texts, and a child is doing a piece of descriptive writing and they describe everything as being either big, little, tiny, or small? Is there actually limitations there because the child is using only a sort of limited range of ideas on how to use pre-modifying adjectives? So hone in on particular word classes. Also look at semantic fields that are going on. Look at primary semantic fields, but also look at secondary semantic fields as well. So if a child is doing a piece of persuasive writing, okay, and let's say they're doing a piece of persuasive writing about the environment, about keeping the environment of the playground and the school absolutely tidy, sure that you're going to have the semantic field of the school, things to do with the school, but there may well be other semantic fields lurking underneath it, which are helping the child kind of make their argument. So it might be, for example, that they're drawing upon the semantic field of war, in which they're showing this battle against pollution and litter is a bit like, it's like a conflict, it's like a military conflict. So sophisticated writers, and it may be that you have an 8, 9, 10-year-old who's writing in a very sophisticated way, they may well be drawing upon a range of interesting secondary semantic fields. Okay, look at things like subject-specific lexis, and this really goes with the idea of hyponymy. Hyponymy means categorization of words. So look to see to what extent are children using a sophisticated range of lexis that are specifying like nuances and subtle differences between things. So how specific is the lexis being used? Is there a balance between hyponyms, which means specific things like bench, stool, and seat, and hypernyms, which is like a general word like furniture? Other thing to think about maybe is the vocabulary used, is it standard? Or are there dialectical elements in it? Are there regional dialectical elements in it? If there are regional dialectical elements in it, it may be appropriate for the context, because if it's a piece of narrative writing that's giving the flavour of the local area, maybe that's part of the effectiveness of it. Okay. Look particularly at the use of figurative or literal language. If you're going to have lots of figurative language going on in it, like, for example, imagery, personification, simile, metaphor, anthropomorphism, those sorts of things, figurative language, then that could well be a marker of sophistication. And you could make a linkage there with the research done by James Britton that calls that kind of language poetic, even though it might not be poetry. So has the child used figurative language in an appropriate way for the task? And are there sort of connotative or pragmatic meanings going on where, for example, you might have elements of irony? Again, I'm thinking about older children here, where they might be saying one thing, but there may be actually connotations of other things going on. And generally, in terms of lexis, look at word classes. So if you've got a text that is dominated by adverbs, then obviously point that out and try and identify the different kinds of adverbs, whether they're adverbs of place or time or duration or whatever. And are they appropriate? How do they link in with the meanings and the contexts? So there's absolutely tons to say about Lexis. Okay, so grammar and Lexis, they make a good combination of areas to things to talk about. And I'm saying that because often when people write about children's writing, they get stuck into spelling. And then they write an entire essay that's purely about the spelling. Now, spelling is interesting, and there's lots and lots of things to say about it. But there are other things, and you might well get a question like this. So the success of children's writing depends wholly upon their lexical and grammatical choices. So this is another one of these questions where you're going to be saying yes, but, or in this case, no, but. So to some extent, you're going to be saying, well, Lexis and grammar are very important. But then you're going to be saying, actually, there are other elements like discourse and orthography and graphology, which are equally important. Okay, so you'll be given a bit of detail. And if you were in my group, we'd be looking together at a bit of detail like this. So here is a story by a Key Stage 1 pupil. So this pupil is about 6 or 7 years old. There was an egg that never opened, so they got a sword, but it didn't break, and it went bigger every time. At Christmas, it didn't crack, so they got a knife, but it still didn't crack, so they picked it up and throwed it on the floor, but it did not. Then it was Easter, and the egg hatched out. A bird. Now, that's a marvellous piece of writing. I mean, for a Key Stage 1 pupil, I mean, we're talking in that age group of 5 to 7 years old. That is an extended, really interesting piece of writing for that stage. Okay, so in terms of the stages, you'd be saying, yeah, it's certainly way beyond preparatory stage of Kroll and consolidation stage. It seems to be mastering everything that Kroll is talking about in the consolidation stage. So what could you say about the Lexis and the grammar that's going on? So what I'd say to you is pause the video, and you need to be making notes now on what you're observing on the Lexis and the grammar based on the kinds of things that we talked about in the previous slides. Okay, so let me talk about some of these things then. So the Lexis does tend to be monosyllabic. Okay, so if you look at the first 2 lines there, so the vast majority of words there are monosyllabic. You've got never, you've got the adverbial never, and you've got opened. Both of those are disyllabic, but the rest of them are monosyllabic. And it does tend to be dominated by concrete words, so things like egg and sword, so things that you can see and touch. We have a bit of an absence of certain word classes. We don't have anything in the way of adjectives and adverbs, and therefore this is why this is in the consolidation stage rather than a differentiation stage, because it kind of restricts the effectiveness of the narrative. We don't have anything in the way of adjectives and adverbs, and we don't have anything in the way of figurative language either. Okay. We have material verbs. So we've got a verb like throwed, for example. Throwed is quite interesting because what you've got there is overextension, overgeneralization, where the child is putting the ed, or in this case, the d inflection on the end, thinking that it's a weak verb, when actually in English it's a strong, irregular verb. So we've got material verbs, which denote action. We've got it being used, so here and here. So it, the pronoun, is being used successfully because it's referring back. It's an anaphoric reference. Oh, let me put the light on. I'm back again, don't worry. Put the money in the meter. So we've got anaphoric references back, but we have a bit of lack of clarity caused by the use of the third person plural subject pronoun, they. Who are they? You know, so they picked it up. Well, the writer hasn't told us who they are, so there's a bit of an issue there. We also have a bit of an issue with repetition, don't we? We've got did not crack, for example, coming back. So that shows a kind of lexical limitation. And you could say that the narrowness of the Lexis is shown because rather than, for example, the child is saying it went bigger every time. Now, we know exactly what the child means, but that's fairly basic in terms of using a basic material verb and that comparative adjective. So the child has not used the slightly more sophisticated verbs grew or expanded. So again, this is why this is in the consolidation rather than the differentiation stage. What else can we say about grammar? Well, the sentences are wholly declarative, which I suppose is reasonably appropriate for genre. There's no variation. There are no questions asked or imperatives or exclamatives. We have compound sentences, so linked with coordinating connectives. So, for example, a good example of a coordinating connective. So this is typical of your Kroll's consolidation stage, the idea of speech written down. Look at the tenses, the verbs, opened, got, went, didn't. So past tense verbs are used in a consistent way, so that's to be credited. There is some awareness of the difference between weak and strong past tense forms. So the child has said opened in a perfectly standard way, but they've also used went as well, rather than goed. So there is some awareness of the difference between weak and strong past tense verbs, i.e. regular and irregular past tense verbs. But you've also got the throwed bit, which I've mentioned in the previous slide, which you could classify as a virtuous error. And look at the clauses. The clauses are dominated by SVO, subject, verb, object. There's no evidence of the passive voice, which might have been used to kind of give a little bit of variety to the action. So it's limited in that respect. All in all, it's a very successful piece of writing for a child at that age. Okay, and there's plenty for you to say in terms of grammar and Lexis. Okay, so if I were you, if you were in my class now, I would get you to be from memory talking about or writing down what these things are. So what are these concepts, and can you give us examples of them? That would be a good way to be reviewing your knowledge about children's writing. We are going to call it a day there. So we've got through a lot of really good material there, and I will see you another time. Thank you.